Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And as always, I want to remind you all that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. So we would ask that you could consider becoming a regular contributor. You can go to justandsinner.org. Go to our donate page there, and you could find a number of different ways that you can support us and the work that we do. Just want to make another mention, as I did in the last program, that we have now completed our publication of Paul Kretzmann's commentaries on the Old Testament. So we have a series of volumes going all the way from the book of Genesis through the book of Malachi, covering the entirety of the Old Testament from a Lutheran perspective. So if you're looking for a commentary on one or two books or the entirety of the Old Testament, you can pick up the whole set. You go to jspublishing.org. These are a very kind of lay level commentary as well. So this isn't something that gets really into Hebrew. It's something that's very helpful for the pretty average layperson as well. So it's the kind of thing that you could use in a small group Bible study or something like that at your church, and use it as a companion to study of whatever Old Testament book you may be studying through. If you want to check out our New Testament commentary series that we publish, you can also look at our Lutheran commentary series, also available at jspublishing.org. Well, I want to get in again to our series on the Augsburg Confession. It's been a while since we've talked about the Augsburg Confession, and this is a series that started a long time ago, and we have been working our way through it very slowly. But we are getting now toward the end of the main articles of faith in the Augsburg Confession. So I really want to get these done pretty quickly. It would be great to have actually finished this part of the series by the end of the summer. So we'll see where things go, as I have a lot of other things planned as well. But I want to get through the rest of this portion of the Augsburg Confession, and then we can get into some of the abuses that are being corrected, which those parts will be a little bit more of a historical dive into some of the things going on in the medieval period. But we've done some history throughout this series, as if you've listened to the other ones in this series, you would know. Now, if you haven't listened to the other ones in this series, you'll still be able to follow along fine with this particular topic, and it should be that way with really any of the ones in this series. I would encourage you to listen to or watch them all, but if you haven't, that's okay. You should be able to follow along pretty well just on whatever topics that you may be interested in diving into perhaps a little more deeply. So we are now at Article 16, and Article 16 has the heading of civil affairs. Just a reminder again, the version that I'm using is the one that we publish, which is the Augsburg Confession with a historical introduction and notes by Charles Krauth. So if you want to pick up your copy of this, this includes good historical introduction and then some comments at the end as well. But there are many editions. You can find them for free online in all sorts of places. Go to bookofconcord.org. You can find the Augsburg Confession free on there, along with the rest of the Lutheran confessions. Okay, so we're going to be looking at civil affairs. So basically what we're talking about here is the relationship between the Christian and the state. What is the proper role of civil government, and what should the proper interaction be between the church or the individual Christian and then society or the state? Now, there are some important historical things to keep in mind as we look at this article. There are a couple of different developments in terms of the Christian's relationship to the state that occur in the medieval period and at the Reformation that really have to be kept in mind as we're talking through this. So the critique in this article is really twofold, and you see this throughout the history of the polemics that take shape in the post-Reformation era as well. And that is, on the one side, there is the problem of the medieval papacy. And the medieval papacy was, for any student of history, of any medieval history whatsoever, knows that the Pope was very involved in civil politics. The Pope was very involved in what happened in the state. And the Pope had these kind of basically two swords. There was that of the kingdom of God and that of the civic realm. And the church had control over both, controlled both in different ways, but it did have control over both. Now, there are a number of historical factors that lead to this with the Bishop of Rome. We see that Pope Leo, for example, who is famous for Leo's tome, which helps form part of the Chalcedonian definition of the natures of Christ at the Council of Chalcedon, the first really significant, theologically significant, and not just theologically, but very significant Pope or Bishop of Rome that we find in the church. And while these barbarian invaders are coming into the Roman Empire, so in the 5th century, Rome is sacked, and we have a gradual fall of the Roman Empire, at least in the Western world. In the Eastern world, the Roman Empire basically just becomes the Byzantine Empire, and in many ways, the Byzantine Empire really just saw itself as a continuation of what was the Roman Empire. But at least the Western part of the empire falls, and it does so slowly through these barbarian attacks, the famous name of Attila the Hun. So Leo goes out in the city of Rome and tells the barbarians who are attacking to spare the churches, and they do. So Leo is seen as a figure of a heroic figure for the empire, and he was in a lot of ways, and as well as theologically, because he provides this definition of the two natures of Christ in his tome that is going to be influential for the Council of Chalcedon. And so from that point forward, with Leo, there is a trust in the Bishop of Rome, in that office, as having some kind of civic authority as well, to some degree. Now, this changes very drastically, and you see this with Gregory the Great, who around 600 A.D. is Pope, so we're talking the very early beginnings of the Middle Ages. Luther calls Gregory the Great the last good pope. But Gregory is really the first of the medieval popes. He's often been referred to that way, and again, there's still a slow progress. And Gregory has a lot of great pastoral insight as well. Gregory was a really significant and important figure in a lot of positive ways. But Gregory was a politician before he was elected Bishop of Rome. So what you have in Gregory is a figure that is looked at, especially in the midst of the chaos of the fall of what was the Roman Empire. And there is no structured empire in the sense in the West now that you had in the past. So people do begin looking to the leaders of the church for political guidance as well. And Gregory kind of typifies that because he's a wise politician as well as a wise theologian and Christian thinker. But as the years go on and that relationship develops and is strengthened, and the papacy is drawn much farther into a lot of corruption. Now, that doesn't mean every single pope was this way, but by the time you get to the 10th century, people reference the papacy as the pornocracy. So it gives you an idea of the corruption that is there within the papacy. And just like happens when anybody comes into a position of significant power, especially political power, there is a lot of corruption, and there is definitely an unhealthy intermingling of the affairs of the church and the affairs of the state. And the Pope exercises a significant amount of political authority. And there are certain promises that popes can make to certain people to get certain favors, like maybe a child, often an illegitimate child, could be made a bishop somewhere or an archbishop somewhere for political favors, basically. And this corruption is, it's universally acknowledged at this point. I mean, everybody acknowledges corruption in the papacy. Of course, the Roman Catholics don't see that this invalidates the papacy because of the corruption in the Middle Ages. But I think everybody acknowledges at this point that there was a significant amount of corruption. So what you have then is this unfortunate intermingling of church and state that leads to these abuses of power, a conflation of the purposes of the church and the purposes of the state. A good example of this would be the Crusades. So in the Crusades, and the Crusades are very often misunderstood, so I think when the kind of atheist arguments that you often hear just thrown out, like, oh, the Crusades were bad and Christians just engaged in the Crusades because they just thought it was fun to kill people, it's really not accurate at all. It's a political battle as much as anything else. The Muslims wanted control of Jerusalem. The Christian Empire wanted control of Jerusalem. It's just like any other war. It's a territorial battle. There's fear of Islamic invasion and Islamic expansion into Western Europe, the same kind of fears that are still there at the time of the Reformation as well. That's why Luther writes so much about the Turks. He's speaking about Islam. So it's a political situation that's much more complex than the often cited, they just thought it would be fun to kill a bunch of people or something, which is just not true at all. But nonetheless, what you see here is there's the political interest in driving back Islam. And because of the tie between, say, war or politics, the state, and the church, now the church can offer indulgences, what you see later as in the indulgences, controversies surrounding the Reformation, where people are paying money in order to receive years off of purgatory for either themselves or a relative. That same kind of thing is occurring with the Crusades. So there is a promise of forgiveness. There is a promise, a salvific promise that is given to crusaders. So there are these eternal benefits that are given or promised by the church if they will go to war. So here I think is a great example of how this conflation of church and state works. Of course, you have the Inquisition that is very well known. There's a lot of bloodshed toward heretics in the Inquisition. And you have, for example, the church trying to make excuses for lying and telling people that they have safe passage, like John Huss was promised at the Council of Constance. He was told he had safe passage. He did not. And they said you can lie to heretics, which is really more of an Islamic idea than one that has any foundation in Christianity whatsoever. So here are just some examples. And the history is tied up with many, many of these examples. So at the time of the Reformation, of course, one of the things that needs to be reformed, and again, as I think everyone acknowledges that there needed to be some reform from all different perspectives. So one of the concerns is that we distinguish the church from the state. And this is not to say that the state is bad, the church is good. This is not to say that the church has nothing to say to the state, or that there is no connection between these two at all. And this is often a misunderstanding of the teaching of the Reformation that I find in the integralists or integralists. I hear it pronounced both ways, and I'm never sure which one is correct. But those Roman Catholics who want a very, very much an integrated system of church and state today, it's often said that the Reformation has this radical divorce, that the state is this purely secular thing, and that you had basically free reign of people doing whatever they want. The church didn't have anything to say to the state, which then led to the Enlightenment and secularism and everything else. It's really not an accurate portrayal of the history at all. So it's not the perspective of the Lutheran Confessions that the church is this purely secular sphere. But I do have something to say about that, actually, as we're using the term secular. Sometimes you will find in Lutheran writings the use of the term secular, but they don't mean by secular what people mean by secular today. So I understand why the misreading of the sources happens. But there's no concept whatsoever in the 16th century of a state that has no religious affiliation, or a government that is just there to protect people's individual liberties that's not connected to the church in any way, or religion in any way. It's just not a conception that exists. Nobody's thinking in those terms. So when ideas of language of secularity is used, what they mean is that the state, not that the state should not be a Christian state. They're very adamantly in favor, someone like Luther, of the state being a Christian state. And he has multiple treatises writing about this. And this is the way the state was in Germany. It's been argued by some that the princes were far too involved in the church and the decisions of the church at that time. And that's a kind of separate but related issue. So when they mean secular, what they're saying is it's not the role of the state to administer word and sacrament. That is what the church does. It is not the role of the state to decide what is heretical theology. It is not the role of the state to decide what people believe in their hearts or regulate people's personal beliefs. The state's role is dealing with external behaviors, which, by the way, would, for Luther at least, also include some external behaviors that were blasphemous being punished by the state. But it doesn't judge the heart. There should be no forced conversions, because conversion is a matter of the heart, and that is not something that the state has a proper regulation over at all. So that's when they use the term secular that you sometimes see in translations of some older sources. That's what they're talking about, not the post-Enlightenment notion of secularity, which means some kind of religious neutrality. There's no such thing. And for the 16th century reformers, there is no such thing as religious neutrality. And there's that quote that's often attributed to Luther, where supposedly he says that he would rather be ruled by a smart Turk than a dumb Christian. I've never been able to find that quote in Luther, and I think that it's something Luther would never say at all. Luther would be horrified about the idea of an Islamic leader. Historically, that's whatever you do with that. I'm just saying historically, the case would be that he would be horrified at that kind of idea. That notion of secularity is really more a product of our contemporary post-Enlightenment age than it is a 16th century idea that you'd find in Luther. And then the other battle that's being fought here, or the other side that's being critiqued, is not just the conflation of church and state within medieval politics and the role of the papacy at that time, but also they're writing against what is the view of the Anabaptists. Now, the radical Anabaptists, known as the radical reformers, took a perspective that was wildly different from the magisterial reformers. Now, magisterial refers to those reformers who worked with the state. So we're talking about the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Anglicans, basically. And then you have the Anabaptists as the radical perspective. So the Anabaptists opposed Christian involvement in politics. And so they make the argument that Christians should not really be involved in civic affairs at all. They shouldn't be involved in the state, that the state was a corrupt sphere, and that Christians should essentially establish their own societies. Now, the Anabaptists at this time are not a centralized group at all. They are later. So when you get to Menno Simons and the development of the Mennonites, Menno Simons is really the first theologian of the Anabaptists, because they're theologically all over the place. And you get someone like an Andreas Karlstadt, who was a colleague of Luther's, who then became an Anabaptist leader. And he was radicalized in a lot of ways. So you do have some figures showing up like that. But Menno Simons is really the first significant theological thinker among the Anabaptists. But prior to Menno Simons, there are a lot of different ideas among the Anabaptists of how the Christians should relate to society. And that was basically the agreement of all Anabaptists that, they agreed basically on two things, if you could tie them together in any way, because they're all over the place. You have a lot of Arians, anti-Trinitarians among the Anabaptists, and ones who are far more orthodox than others. But the two things that really unite the Anabaptists are, one, they are opposed. One is that, they believe in believers-only baptism, adult baptisms. That's why they get the name Anabaptist, so a re-Baptist, someone who rebaptizes. So you get that. But then the second area of agreement is that the society of Christendom is bad, that has developed in the medieval period. There's so much corruption that true Christians need to have their own society that is righteous, apart from what's been going on in this time period. And there are basically two ways to do that. The one way to do that is to revolt against the state. And so you have things like the Peasants' Revolt. You have other revolts as well, and leaders that say that you have Luther writing about the Zukal prophets who claim that they're prophesying some great overthrow of the state, and there will be this new state that's going to treat the peasants well. And the peasants were poorly treated. There are valid reasons for their complaints. This doesn't come out of nowhere. And Luther himself is even sympathetic to some of those concerns, but not of the radical revolution that the peasants then do eventually engage, and a bunch of them are killed. It's a horrible story. But some of the Anabaptists believe in this revolution, that they're going to take over. There are prophets saying that they're going to bring about the kingdom of God. After those revolutions fail, then they move into a more pacifistic form that we know today, which is we do need to have these Christian societies, but these Christian societies are these basically isolated communes where we come together, kind of do our own thing, ignore the outside world altogether. And in this way, they are much more similar to a kind of monastic approach to life in some ways, though in other ways not, because the monastics are still connected to the church that's connected to, of course, the magistrate and the external world. But the Anabaptists are much more cut off than that. But no matter what kind of Anabaptist you are, which leaders you follow within the Anabaptist movement, you're basically going to agree in one way or another that we need to have a Christian society that differs from what was going on in medieval Christendom. So that's kind of the historical background here of this article, to understand what are the errors that are being addressed. Where does the Lutheran Reformation fit into this broader political context? So now I'm going to start reading some of what the actual text says. Keep all of that background in mind, which hopefully should be helpful in explaining where they're coming from here. So, concerning civil affairs, they teach that such civil ordinances are lawful are good works of God. So civil ordinances, now the language of civil means in society beyond the church. Public society, we're speaking largely of government, but not exclusively of government. Lutherans will use the term civil to refer to civic righteousness, for example, which is righteousness of the body. The righteous are good things that people do, whether they have faith in their heart or don't have faith in their heart. There are things that are good that Christians and non-Christians both do. In terms of motivation from the heart, they are not doing things which are truly spiritually good without faith because they are not done in faith. But externally, there are plenty of good things in the world that all sorts of non-Christians do. You can be an atheist and support a charity. You can be of any kind of religion and do a positive work for the benefit of the world, protecting the neighbor, those kind of things. So that we put those in the category of civic righteousness. So we understand that there are things that are external, and those external things are the civic things or the civil things. They aren't related to matters of the heart. So we have a civic righteousness. So civil affairs are those which have to do with a civic righteousness. So being a judge or being a police officer, being some kind of public servant. So these are lawful and good works of God. So they're saying that, yes, you can be and should be involved in civic affairs as a Christian. Continued, that Christians may lawfully bear civil office. And this is something that, again, the Anabaptists will not do. They do not promote the notion that the Christian can in any way be involved in a civic office. You don't find Anabaptists who are running for, even their local town council, really. They're not involved in these kinds of things because they don't think that the kingdom of the world is something that Christians should be involved in such a way. Okay, so the Christians may lawfully bear a civil office, sit in judgments, so you could be on a jury or you can be a judge. If you are a Christian, you can make decisions about civic matters, because as a Christian, God has created you with a physical body in a civic realm, not just as this spiritual substance divorced from all bodily or earthly things. Okay, you can sit in judgments, determine matters by the imperial laws and other laws in present force, appoint just punishments, engage in just war, act as soldiers, make legal bargains and contracts, hold property, take an oath when the magistrates require it, marry a wife, or be given in marriage. All right, that's a lot of stuff that's mentioned there. So let's go through each of these things. But maybe I'll read the condemnation after this. It says they condemn the Anabaptists who forbid Christians these civil offices. So we could talk about each of these things. So these are all things that certain people at the time of the Reformation, radical reformers, are saying should be done away with. It even mentions marriages. And yeah, you've got some wacky people that are saying marriage is overthrown. But that's not the majority of any Anabaptists today. But you do see this within weird cult movements. So you had some of that weirdness back then too, just like you have anywhere. But that's not something that you'll find too common of a theme or an issue. Though there have been, if you look at John Howard Yoder and who's one of the most significant Anabaptist theologians in recent history, his view of marriage and sexuality is pretty ugly if you look at the accusations toward him. So maybe there's some grounds for that as well still today. But I think the majority of people would be horrified by that kind of stuff. All right, so let's look at some of these. So we have, first of all, the just war. Let's maybe take that question, because just war can be a very difficult issue. And it is a difficult issue in the early church, because Christians, by and large, in the early church, prior to Constantine, they're not engaging in warfare for the most part. And the reason for that is that in the New Testament, we do see various principles that are shown over and over again in the life of Jesus of non-retaliation. So, of course, turn the other cheek kind of language that we find repeatedly in the words of Jesus. So in one interpretation of that, we say, well, if we are not to engage in any kind of self-defense, if Jesus says, someone smacks you on one cheek, turn to the other cheek, we're not supposed to strike back. Peter uses the imagery of the example of Jesus, when he's being beaten and he doesn't talk back, he doesn't do anything. He lets himself be hurt and killed passively as he dies on the cross. And so the humiliation of Christ does serve as this groundwork for how we are to live or how we are to function in our lives. So in light of that, the question is, how can we say that we can go to war? Because we are not supposed to kill, but you can go to war, so you can kill? What's going on? How does this make any sense? And when we can look at a scriptural testimony of this, and there are a couple of things to look at scripturally. The one is just how the Old Testament functions. And the Anabaptists tend to have the most radical divorce between the Old and New Testaments of any of the Reformation groups. The Calvinists have a stronger link between Old and New Testaments. The Anabaptists have this radical break between Old and New Testaments. Dispensationalists would be kind of the inheritors of a similar attitude to that. And Lutherans are somewhere in the middle on these points. But we look at the Old Testament, of course, there are a number of just godly people that are required to go to war. I mean, the Israelites are divinely commanded to go to war. David is a king, and David is pointed at as like the most righteous person in the Old Testament. So if we look at the Old Testament and how the people of God function in the Old Testament, we have to ask some questions if we're going to say that what's required in the New Covenant is an absolute pacifism. Then we have to say there is this radical break with the old covenant, which certainly didn't promote a radical pacifism at all. Where there are justifications for war, and there is justification for punishment and warfare, and those things are seen as positive and good. So is there a radical break? Is it that maybe the command to love your enemies was a totally new commandment? Well, no. I mean, the love your neighbor as yourself command shows up in the book of Leviticus, and we certainly have commandments about mercy. I mean, read something like the book of Amos repeatedly. So in the Old Covenant, we see that the people of God are commanded to be gracious, they're commanded to be forgiving, they're commanded to love, to be merciful, to show care toward foreigners. So when we see commands in the New Testament, they're not, while they are more maybe explicit in some ways, especially about how one responds to persecution in particular, persecution for the faith, they are not something radically divorced from the Old Testament. So we have to ask the question then, do we have a radical break between Old and New Testaments on this issue? Now, in other issues, of course, we do. So if you point to the ceremonial laws of Israel, we have a number of places where it's made abundantly clear that those things are fulfilled in Christ, and therefore we don't have to observe those ceremonial laws anymore. So read the book of Galatians, which is the most significant. But you can also look at the transition in the book of Acts from the Jewish church to the Gentile church, Acts 15, the vision that is received by Peter, and there are a number of other places. I mean, 1 Timothy, Colossians deal with these questions. It's all over the place. So the New Testament is clear in saying this is an area where there is that clear break. Then you have where the theonomists are going to argue, for example, if you're familiar with theonomy, it's a movement within the Reformed Church, a very small portion of the Reformed Church, where people argue that the Old Testament civic laws, in all their specificity, should be obeyed today. And yeah, they do say it's applied in a modern context, so maybe the punishment shouldn't be stoning, it should be something else. But essentially that the civic laws for Israel do continue on today, which fits, again, better with a Reformed approach to the relationship between the Old and New Covenants, because they do tend to see them as more continuous than Lutherans do. Though again, Lutherans don't see them as totally discontinuous either. But that's why it tends to have more appeal from a Reformed context. But there I would say, well, how does the nation of Israel relate to nations today? Because I think to say that we should have those same civic laws necessitates that there is some kind of connection between civic Israel and various other nations. And when you see how the prophecies about Israel, how the various Old Testament texts about Israel are applied in the New Covenant, in the New Testament, they are applied to the church. They are not applied to particular nations. If that's the truth, that's the case, then and if it's the case that the nation of Israel existed for the particular purpose of bringing forth the seed that is Christ, then I don't see that we have to use those same exact laws today, that they were meant to be some kind of universal standard. But it's quite a leap from that to say that, no, the civic laws of the Old Testament don't need to be exactly replicated in every nation today, to saying the principle of having nations or being involved in any kind of acts of punishment at all is now somehow unjust. And we need to get away from that altogether. And I just don't see that laid out anywhere in the New Testament. So I would say that when you see the New Testament interacting with questions of justice and those in office, and it's not like it's never addressed, never is there this radical break mentioned. So what we do have is we have testimony in the book of Revelation that, well, the state is often the beast. Okay, the state is often against the church and will persecute the church. So there is that, where the Anabaptists, I think, heavily cite those kinds of passages, which is true. The state will persecute the church, and the state often is an instrument of the devil. That's clear. So that there is persecution that happens throughout history. But does that mean that Christians shouldn't be involved in the state, or that every state is the beast? Well, we certainly have testimony throughout Scripture and other places. Romans 13 being the most famous. Read through Romans 13, which is very clear and explicit that the one who wields the sword, the emperor, in this case, Emperor Nero at the time, quite an evil dude, the one who ended up killing Paul, and the first real legal persecutor of the church. There are plenty of others in Rome and ones that are worse, but Nero is pretty awful. He's just awful in general. If you read about Nero's life, he's not a nice guy. Not the kind of guy you'd want to be friends with. So Nero is referred to by Paul, and he's referring not just to Nero, but he's the one that's in charge at this time, but he's referring to just government in general. And he says that those who are in that position are put there by God himself, and that they are instruments of justice. Now, Paul does not portray being an instrument of justice as a bad thing. He doesn't say it's bad that they punish evil. He celebrates the fact that they punish evil. That is part of their office. It's a good thing that they punish evil. And if it is the case that the one who is in a position of power is a servant of God and is acting justly in punishing evil, how then are we to say that a Christian cannot do that? Can a Christian not be a public servant of God and enact justice, which is good? It doesn't seem to fit how Paul is discussing that. And so we have another instance where John the Baptist, in John the Baptist's ministry, he baptizes all sorts of people. And a lot of them are Jews. But there is one instance in which John the Baptist encounters a Roman soldier. And I want to read this text. So this is from the Gospel of Luke. This is in chapter 3. And Luke is describing the different kinds of people that approach John the Baptist as he's preaching his baptism of repentance. Starting in verse 12. Then tax collectors also came to be baptized and said to him, "Teacher, what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Collect no more than what is appointed for you." So this is significant. Tax collectors. He doesn't say, stop working for the evil government. He says, no, do your job, but do it justly. Don't be the unjust tax collectors that use this as an opportunity to take from people. Serve the state, but serve faithfully in a way that is just and right and honorable. Then again, in verse 14, likewise the soldiers asked him, saying, "And what shall we do?" So he said to them, "Do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely, and be content with your wages." So this is how repentance is to be lived out for servants of the state. We have an explicit example in the New Testament of what it means to live a life of repentance as one who works for the state, both as being a tax collector and being a Roman soldier. And in neither case does he say the state is evil, don't work for the state. John the Baptist says, no, just be good and just. So this is the principle that we find outlined in Scripture. And if that's the case, that means Christians can indeed and should even be involved in the civic sphere for the good of the neighbor. But when Christians do engage in the civic sphere, they are not to do so in a way that is unjust. So if you are a Christian in a political position, don't lie about your political opponents when you're running for office, just to get points and get people on your side. Don't bribe people to get votes. Don't lie to people. Be honest. I don't know if that's possible, but be an honest politician. That's what a repentant politician is required to do. And if you look at the political life, yeah, you know that power corrupts. And Scripture is also very clear about power corrupting, especially when God warns the people of Israel about a king. So Christians should always be wary of giving too much power to government, because we know that power corrupts, and God is very explicit about that. And so is like the entirety of the history of the human race, especially when it comes to questions of government. But just because there is a corruption that happens with government does not mean that all Christians should disengage from government or serving in the public sphere or in civic society. And so this, is further addressed. There's mention of just wars we were talking about. Now, the question of just war, there's nowhere in the New Testament that explicitly says war can be just, and by the way, here are the guidelines for determining if a war is just or not. It would be nice if that were the case, that it did, but it doesn't do that. So Christian theologians then have to, and not just theologians, but politicians and those involved in the civic sphere have to try to figure out what is it that makes a war just and what is it that makes a war unjust. War is never desirable. As Christians, we should certainly never desire death in any way. That doesn't mean it's not a necessity at times in a fallen world, though. So that it is possible for Christians to go to war. It should not be done hastily, but it should be done in justice, knowing that there are times where it is an unfortunate necessity of living in a fallen world. So where do we see that? Well, again, we see in the Old Testament, certainly there is the ability for soldiers to go to war. But then you look at the New Testament, you say, hey, but there's no nation of Israel, which is true. We can't make an exact equation between Israel and the United States or something and say, well, because they had this haram, this holy war in the Old Covenant, that we can have this holy war today or something and say God has divinely commanded us to go attack nation X, Y, or Z, and that God will give us protection like he did to Israel. We can't do that theologically. We're not Israel. So we don't want to go too far with that. But we do see the general principle of war being acceptable at certain times, even prior to the formation of Israel as a nation. But also, we see this instance of the soldier here. And so he's not only a civic servant, he's specifically a soldier. And he isn't told, war is always evil, you shouldn't be a soldier. And those who are soldiers know, of course, it's not your role in that position to determine what is just and what is not. I mean, a military couldn't survive that way if every individual soldier had to determine whether you follow orders. I mean, that's what you do. Good soldiers follow orders if you watch The Bad Batch. But that is what, I mean, that's what you do. But those who are in leadership positions, who are making those decisions about war, it is your responsibility. And the blood is on your hands at that point. Like, you have to take that very seriously and not jump into that hastily at all. So how then can this be the case if the Christian is to be loving and forgiving and accept persecution? So how because it seems to be a kind of contradiction to say a Christian can go to war and a Christian can enact justice in a civic court, whereas a Christian can't enact justice when being persecuted at other times. Scripture's pretty clear about that. Someone slaps me on the cheek, it would be justice if I slapped them back, and they would deserve it. But we're told not to. So how do these two things fit together? And you can kind of understand why the Anabaptists are a bit confused about how this fits together, because it seems like a contradiction. Well, this really gets down to Luther's conception of vocation. And Luther understood rightly that we are called as God's people to serve in various vocations. We have various callings in life. And in those callings in life, we enact God's will in the world in various ways. Now, what is good in one vocation is not good in another vocation necessarily. So that depending upon what role I am serving in, something could be good or it could not be good. Right? If I am called as a husband to act a certain way toward my wife, If I act that way towards someone else's wife, not in the role of a husband, that's called adultery and it's a sin. So we all recognize this to some degree. Gene Veith, I know he uses the example in his book on vocation of, what would you call somebody who cuts up somebody's body and, plays with their organs and then sews them back up? Well, you'd call them a psychopath, unless they're a surgeon. So a surgeon can do that because that's their calling. You can't, if you're not trained in surgery or you do it to an unwilling victim and do that to them, now all of a sudden that's become a horrible act of evil. But when you're serving in that vocation doing it, it's okay. Why can I not find somebody speeding on the road and, travel behind them until they pull over and give them a ticket? Because I'm not a police officer. That's not my vocation and calling. So when we understand that helps us to see how things are just in some contexts and not in other contexts. And Luther talks about the executioner. If you are an individual Christian and you are an executioner, that's your job, is to enact justice. You could do it. Luther would say, yes, you can kill. You can kill in that position because you are an instrument of justice. Now, if your killing was motivated not by you being a servant of the state and a servant of justice, but by revenge toward that person, that is a sin. So in your private life, in your Christian life, in your interpersonal relationships, we cannot fight. We are passive. We do receive persecution as a church. And that doesn't mean we can't do anything about it, but we don't take up our arms and immediately fight back. We don't play, Peter cutting off the soldier's ear. We're not called to do that. But if I'm in the military, that's part of my role. That's part of my vocation. God has called me to do that. If, say, someone broke into my house and threatened to hurt my wife and my kids, and I would have no hesitation in harming or killing that person to protect my family. There would be no hesitation whatsoever, and I think that was a 100% just act at that point. Well, why is that the case? Because it's part of my role as a father to protect my family. And if that's the case, that role of protecting my family comes first. So I protect them, and I protect them by enacting justice. That is a just thing because I am serving in that role. Now, that's a very different thing from someone, if my wife is like, oh, that person's being kind of nasty to me, and I walk over to him and punch him in the face. You see, there's a difference in those two situations, because one is I'm serving as a protector specifically to protect my family here at home, and that is what I am called to do. The other is being angry and out of revenge, going out of my way to harm somebody. So these are paradoxes oftentimes, and it's difficult to tease out when maybe something is just and when it's not in light of some of this, but that's how we function in normal life. We function that way in society. So the person who is the IRS can take our money, whether we want them to or not, they do. But if someone else comes and takes that same amount of money out of our paycheck, well, then we have a serious problem with it in a very different way. You could debate taxation and whatever. I'm not talking about what the IRS should take or what. But the point is we should recognize, and we do recognize just in various parts of our life, that there is a difference in our various roles and vocations that allow us to think and act differently in these different situations. All right. So then we have related to this, what's mentioned is we can hold property. So some of the Anabaptists live communally and share all property. They share all things with one another, because it is mentioned in the book of Acts that there is a sharing of property that occurs in the early church. And there are groups that live communally today. There are communes today. There are cults that try to do this. It seems like it's a very common cult thing, but not everybody that lives communally is in a cult. There are plenty of communal groups that, on a small scale can work decently well. I think the bigger the scale gets, the more impossible that becomes. And when governments have tried to run themselves in such a way that there's no such thing as private property, then you have lots of death and awful things happening. But the Anabaptists saw this as a necessity, that Christians shouldn't own private property. They should give up all things and have all things in common, share all things. So there are a couple things to say to that. The one is that when you read that happening in the book of Acts, that is a descriptive text, not a prescriptive text, which is a major problem for Anabaptists in general, I think. But in failing to distinguish between the texts that describe what the church did at times and saying that's prescriptive for the church at all times. So just because the church did it does not mean the church has to always do it. And that is a small portion of the beginning of the book of Acts that doesn't seem to be the case when you read the rest of the book of Acts for the majority of the church. And there's no command in any of the epistles to say don't own things. It's just not there. But I would also say just the principles of property that are certainly there in the Old Testament and continued into the New. If you think about what are the commandments, we have commandments about coveting and stealing. Well, those coveting and stealing certainly means that people have property, and that's okay, because you can't covet something that doesn't belong to somebody else. So just the commandment, do not covet or do not steal, means someone actually has this thing and it belongs to them. So there's plenty in the New Testament that talks about not caring too much about your possessions or wealth, being generous with your wealth, giving away wealth. And so it's not like there is this, New Testament certainly doesn't value what we do as capitalists and building up treasures on earth. And the New Testament is very clear that we shouldn't really be worrying about that at all. We should build up for ourselves treasures in heaven. But does that mean that it is wrong for me to own anything at all? No. The New Testament never makes a command like that. And there's nothing indicating that is the case. All right, so we would say that, okay, so that's another error with the Anabaptists. Marriage is obviously okay. There are tons of things in the New Testament that say this. So, and most Anabaptists aren't going to say it's not okay either. You do find you have the Shakers that didn't get married. I mean, they died out. Of course they died out. It's going to happen when you don't get married or have children. You don't have children, you die out. Or then you have the weird cults that do all sorts of weird things that don't get married but have lots of partners. And that is just kind of an obvious thing that's wrong. All right. Moving on into the article here, they condemn also those that place the perfection of the gospel not of the fear of God and in faith, but in forsaking civic offices, inasmuch as the gospel teaches an everlasting righteousness of the heart. So the Anabaptists often argued for Christian perfection. And really, when they're talking about perfection, they often are speaking about absolute sinlessness. It's very clear that some of the Anabaptists even said you have to come to a place where you stop sinning before you can even be part of our community, or you have to stop sinning before you can get baptized. So that Christian perfection is not about the perfection of Christ's righteousness imputed to me or given to me through faith, but instead, for many of the Anabaptists, it's in my living in these explicit ways and giving up earthly things and living in this separated Anabaptist society. But instead, for the Lutherans, no, the gospel teaches about the everlasting righteousness that is granted to us by God that we receive in faith. In the meantime, it doth not disallow order and government of commonwealths or families, but requireth especially the preservation and maintenance thereof as of God's own ordinances, and that in such ordinances we should exercise love. So we're saying that the fact that we have this righteousness of faith does not mean that we don't also have any actions in this world related to civic affairs. This is why Lutherans created this not created as if it didn't exist before, but clearly distinguished between the two kinds of righteousness. That we have this righteousness of the heart, this righteousness that is granted to us freely by faith, the righteousness of Christ, that we are passive in receiving, but we also are called to have an active righteousness in the world, or a civic righteousness. We are called to serve others. We are called to serve in various political or civic offices. We are called to vote. We are called to run for office. We can do all of these various things. Just because it's not the righteousness that saves does not mean it's a righteousness that doesn't matter. Because the external world does matter. God has placed me here with a physical human body in this flesh. God, and as long as I have this body, I have duties and responsibilities to my neighbor. If God didn't care about that at all, we'd be baptized and zapped away. Right? You get baptized, you zoom up to heaven, and you're done. Because, hey, you've got everything you need in your baptism. You've got the full righteousness of Christ. You're adopted into the family of God. What's better than that? You can't do any better than that before God. But God's put you here for however many years he's put you here. And he's given you particular callings in your life, in your family, in your community, in your neighborhoods, in your job, in whatever place you're in your society, your nation. He has duties for you to do while you are here. And those are going to be civic duties. That's part of what our calling is. As long as God leaves us here, we are called to do those things. And so this is also, and this isn't explicitly mentioned in the article, but it certainly is, especially when you read some commentaries in the Augsburg Confession, that this is addressed. And certainly the concern of the early reformers that monasticism itself not be seen as this higher calling that's so much better than being involved in the civic affairs. And it's a similar problem to what you find in the Anabaptists. Not that everything in monasticism is bad, but that the monastic life for many was seen as this is what all spiritual people do. When you get to language that you find in Aquinas of like your second baptism, now you have elevated the monastic life far above the ordinary life, so that the civic affairs of life, those who are engaged in civic life, are not as spiritual as those who are involved in religious life or the monastic life in one way or another. And that's going to be adamantly rejected, to say, no, God has created this physical world too. He rules through state, through the government, and you can be just as spiritual, quote unquote, as the monastic if you're serving as a king or an administrator or a mayor or a police officer or whatever role that you are in. Your role in society is a God-given role in society. Now, you can do that insofar as there is not sin. This doesn't mean any vocation is okay. If this is a vocation that's calling you to sin, obviously that's not good. If your vocation is, drug dealer, sorry, you don't get to say that, well, God called you there and that's your vocation. You're serving your neighbor. No, you don't get to do that. So there are plenty of vocations that are not okay. But so long as you are not working in a sinful vocation, you are doing what God has called you to do, and you are called to serve, and you can serve, and you don't have to run off into some separated community. Now, as I've said before, as we've talked about the Benedict option, there are a lot of benefits to having Christian community too. This is not to say that you don't have any sense of Christian fellowship as being separated from society. And this is always the difficulty that Christians have to balance, and it changes as culture changes as well, but we have to balance between, as Jesus talks about in this high priestly prayer, being in the world but not of the world. So that we are not called to totally retreat as the Anabaptists or many monastics do. Because I know that monastics don't all retreat. I mean, there are very different monastic orders. I think the biggest problem is when you have these, you're taking a vow of silence and you're locked up in a monastery and not engaging with the world. And of course, not all monastic groups do that. So it depends on what order you're a part of. But I think those kinds of monastic groups would be inconsistent with the calling that we have to serve our neighbor. And yes, I know you serve your neighbor in prayer, and that's not that I'm downplaying that, and that's good. But we also should be, when we have these bodies out there serving, using these bodies to do things for the good of the people around us. But then, of course, this doesn't mean that, hey, we don't have any Christian community at all, and you just kind of live in the world like everybody else, and don't cut yourself off from sinful desires or temptations or anything at all. And if you want to learn more about that and my thoughts on that, you can look at the Benedict Option podcast that I did, and I've done some others dealing with similar topics, and I have some other programs on that planned that are going to be speaking with people who are doing things related to that. So, finally here, Christians therefore must necessarily obey their magistrates and laws. So we don't have the authority to just disobey because we don't like the laws. That's really hard for us. That's really hard for us as Americans, in particular, for my American listeners. And I know not all of you are, because I have listeners from all over the place. But those who are my American listeners, I think this is probably most difficult for us, because we we have this kind of rebellious nature, and including myself, within us, and towards stupid laws. Like we want to disobey them. But the calling is, no, we do obey those laws insofar as they are not forcing us to sin. When it gets to the questions of commanding sin, is what it says here, then those are the times when we obey God rather than man. So we have Acts 5:29, where we have the, obeying God rather than man. And this is something that I've, thought about quite a bit. And I've talked to a lot of Christians, especially surrounding certain regulations of, various states surrounding masking and vaccinations and all of those kind of things. Not that I want to get into that discussion at all here, but in light of this, I do think we have to ask ourselves the question, when you're trying to decide whether you should disobey a law that you were given. And there are a lot of considerations, I think, that come up around this. But you do have to ask yourself these questions. Like, is this really an unjust law that is causing me to sin? Or is it something that I can do and will do just because the law says it and the magistrate says it for the time being, even if you don't like it, and even if you may speak against it? Where is there a place for disobedience versus where you obey what we are commanded, what our magistrate commands? Because no matter what, there should be a respect and honor given toward our leaders. That's clear in Romans 13. Now, I'm not saying that's not hard, and harder at some times than others with certain leaders that we may have. But nonetheless, that is our calling. That is part of our calling. And so we have to, and people may come to different points. Christians may, in terms of saying, well, when is it that I can disobey? Because when does it become a matter of sin or not sin? And there will always be challenges there, and the line will not always be clear. So there is a difference between, say, you are, required to wear a mask in the grocery store. That's a different kind of command than the state saying you cannot meet and worship God as a church. See, they're different things. And you have to decide where to draw the line. I'm not going to, I have my opinions, but I am not going to, force that on anybody. But I do think that as Christians and as we, and those aren't the kinds of laws that I think are going to be the big challenges for us. The big laws are going to be surrounding gender and sexuality issues. We do have to prayerfully think through when we disobey and when things go over the line into sin, and when they don't, and when things can be accommodated for the sake of peace. And those are conversations that I think we are going to be having more and more, unfortunately, as a culture and as a society. But don't want to end on that note. But to summarize, we can and should be culturally engaged as Christians, is what the Augsburg Confession is teaching us. We don't need to have a totally retreatist kind of attitude where we just go off totally away from society, but we can and should be engaged civilly in our world. I'll say this is hard for me because there are times when I really do wish I could just go live in a monastery or run off somewhere and ignore everybody. Honestly, it's appealing. It sounds appealing. There are times when I just get so disgusted by the world and the things of the world that I would love to do that. But that doesn't ultimately get rid of sin. And that's the problem is, and Jerome talked about this when Jerome talked about how he spent a lot of time out in the wilderness away from people in prayer. And Jerome has a quote where he says, "But I couldn't stop thinking about dancing women." The point is he's got lust and he's got these lustful thoughts because no matter how much you cut yourself off from society, you could cut yourself off from external temptation. And to some degree, we should cut ourselves off from external temptation. We shouldn't be dumb about putting ourselves in positions of where it's really easy for us to sin because there are temptations everywhere. But Jerome recognized that sin is really a matter of the heart. And by cutting yourself off from society, you're not going to get rid of sin. Because as Jesus says, it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of the heart. Because the problem is our sinful hearts. And unfortunately, we don't get to escape that until we rid ourselves of this sinful flesh. But as long as we are here on this earth, in this sinful flesh, prior to the resurrection, that's what we're going to be dealing with. So hope you found this helpful and instructive as we have been continuing this series. We will, I promise, get through the end of the Augsburg Confession at some point. We're making it our way there, and it may take a little while, but we're going to get there eventually. So thanks so much for watching and or listening. Make sure you do subscribe on YouTube and on your podcast app, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.